Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we have got a great show for you. We're going to start out talking about Austin and the new dynamics of the legislature coming in, and then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to shift up to Minnesota to talk about COVID deaths and whether or not they are being overcounted. So we're going to take our first step here into Austin politics, and on the line with me, a friend of the show and somebody we've had on several times, Matt Makoviak. Matt, are you with me?
I am. How are you, Merrill?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us. Matt is Austin and Washington, D.C. based political consultant. He is president of the Potomac Strategy Group, and they provide political consulting and so forth to conservative campaigns. He served in senior roles for 2 U.S. senators and a governor. He's a native of Austin, graduated from the University of Texas in Austin, and he has 2 blogs. One is a sort of a national one, PotomacFlax.com, and then one Texas-focused, MustReadTexas.com. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad you're able to make it.
Oh, thank you, Merrill. It's great to be with you again.
We have got a new legislature coming in, and we've got a new speaker coming in. The last 2 speakers, Joe Straus and Dennis Bonnen, have not worked out as well as we might have hoped. What do you think about the new speaker?
Yeah, so Dade Phelan has a great reputation. I don't know him personally. His reputation in Austin at the legislature is that he's a hard worker, that he's a smart guy, that he's trustworthy, and that he's been a solid member of the Texas House. And so I think there are pretty good hopes for him, particularly among the legislators themselves. I do think we're going to know something fairly significant here in the next 10 days or so, and that is going to be how many Democrats he appoints to committee chairmanships. A lot of conservatives feel like the number ought to be 0. The challenge is that in the Texas legislature, historically, both parties get chairmanships. And the reason for that is that the speaker generally gets votes from both parties. The last 3 Republican speakers, including Dade Phelan, have all gotten votes from the other party in their vote for speaker. So that is a difference from Texas to D.C. It's a different kind of system. But oftentimes, because Democrats vote for the candidate for speaker, they ultimately get a handful of the chairmanships. For conservatives, the question is going to be, are Democrats appointed to any of the key committees? I don't doubt that some conservative activists are going to be disappointed if even one gets appointed. I do think there will be Democrats appointed. But to me, this is an important question, because if Democrats get appointed to key committees, they will almost surely block significant conservative reforms that are in the Republican Party platform. There are things that the Christian conservatives want to see pursued, particularly pro-life bills, but other things as well, religious liberty bills and other things. So we're going to learn, I think, a lot about Dade Phelan here in the next 10 days, exactly how conservative he is, how he's going to govern. Is he going to be more like Joe Straus, more of a sort of establishment mainstream speaker, or is he going to be more focused on conservative reforms? I think the choice of who he puts in key committee chairmanships is going to tell us a lot.
And Joe Straus sort of took this to a new level, as I understand. He went and campaigned among Democrats and said, if you vote for me, then I'm going to put you in charge of some key committees. And that way he only had to rely upon a few Republicans in order to be able to become speaker. So am I correct? That was something of a new model.
It was a new model, and in Straus's case, I think you can make a pretty good argument that he worked against conservative reforms. And so because of that, it created a divide among Republicans in the Texas House. You had sort of the Strauss wing and the anti-Strauss wing. And Strauss maintained power over multiple sessions by basically combining the Strauss wing of the Republicans with a sort of Strauss wing of Democrats. And so the political reality of that is that it gave those Democrats that supported him sort of veto power over the kinds of conservative reforms that were passing through the Texas Senate and that Governor Greg Abbott wanted to see pursued. That did get blown up when Strauss left, and I would argue that Dennis Bodden was an improvement from Joe Strauss. But I'm really hopeful that Dade Phelan will be an improvement from Dennis Bodden. Is he going to be a hardcore conservative activist, passing every bill that the platform says we should support? No. And so if your standard is perfection, you're going to be disappointed. To me, the question is he going to be better than Dennis Bodden was? And that's the standard I'm going to hold him to, and I hope that he lives up to.
Good. The budget's going to be an issue because with the pandemic, sales were down around the state, and of course we have a state sales tax. The comptroller announced, I believe it was last week, that things are looking a little better than they thought. I believe they've got about $113 billion more than they thought they might, or at least on the budget, but more money than they thought they were going to have. So what do you see happening there? Is this going to be a big fight, or are we going to be able to work through that?
Yeah, the good news is that when the comptroller gave his updated revenue estimate about 10 days ago, the day before the session began, the revenue estimate was revised upward. So the budget deficit is not as bad as it was once believed to be, and that's because Texas has actually weathered the economic shutdown and the COVID pandemic better than most states, and better than the estimates appeared early through middle of last year. So I think we have something like about $1 billion deficit. That's quite a bit better than the $4.6 billion deficit that was estimated just this past summer. And I don't believe that number takes into account the 5% cut to state agency budgets that the big three ordered, I want to say last August or September. So the reality of all that, the upshot of all that, Merrill, is that the budget climate is not as bad as we thought, and I don't think that meeting that budget is going to be a big problem, no.
We've got a couple of minutes left in this segment, but tell me about the Rainy Day Fund. Is there money in the Rainy Day Fund? Is this the kind of time that you would use something like that, or will there be a lot of pressure not to pull any money out of that if there is still money left?
Yeah, no, there's absolutely money left. It's a significant amount of money. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's at least $8 billion. Conservatives in the legislature generally do not want to use that money except for very urgent things. And one of the standards they use is to not use it for sort of annual expenses. So Hurricane Harvey and recovery would be an example. COVID relief would be an example of the kind of thing that would be appropriate. So I do think there's an opportunity for them to tap the Rainy Day Fund this session. Are they going to do it in a major way? I think that's unlikely, but it is something to watch. And it is one of the things that makes Texas one of the strongest states in the country. We have the strongest rainy day fund. We have, the best economic climate of all the states.
There have been groups, Michael Quinn Sullivan being one, that have just really resisted ever using that money. Is this one of those where even those people will say, yes, this is an appropriate time?
Yeah, you're right. Generally, Michael and sort of his crowd oppose almost any use of the rainy day fund, and so I think their position would probably be, let's use the rainy day fund for tax relief. And I don't necessarily know that I'd be against that, but having a rainy day fund is helpful. You could imagine if there were another depression, or if oil prices went through the floor, or there was some other type of terrible calamity that hit Texas, it would be good to have the rainy day fund if we need it. So yeah, it's a fight every session. What's the standard? What's appropriate? How much should be spent? Generally, they're pretty conservative about how they tap the rainy day fund. My
guest is Matt Mackowiak of Potomac Strategies, and we're going to be talking more about Texas if you stay with us. You can go to pointofview.net and find out more about Matt. We've got his bio up there. We've got contact information and other things, and I would encourage you to do that, and also to find out about his blogs, both for national politics and Don't Texas. Stay with us. We'll be back with Matt Mackowiak in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
As even school children know, the British monarchy preceded the American Republic. The framers wanted to change many aspects of their previous government, so they wrote in Article 6 of the Constitution that no title of nobility should be granted by the federal government. But in other areas, they continued the British tradition of the king. One example is in Article 2 that grants the president the power to grant pardons. The framers justified it in a way to restore peace and tranquility. And it certainly provided some of that when clemency was given to Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. But so often the pardon power of the presidency has been misused. President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, hoping to move the nation past the Watergate crisis. It probably cost him the election with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter pardoned nearly 200,000 Vietnam draft dodgers. Perhaps the greatest abuse of the pardon power came from Bill Clinton, who pardoned convicted terrorists with the Weather Underground, along with Patty Hearst, who joined a domestic terrorist group. The pardon most people remember is the pardon he gave to Mark Rich, a racketeer, in large part because of his donations to the Clinton Library and other Democratic candidates. We may appreciate some of the pardons President Trump gave to people like Dinesh D'Souza and Michael Flynn, but he also pardoned Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Charles Kushner, father of Jared Kushner. And since I'm writing this before Donald Trump has left office, the list may include many other pardons for other questionable recipients. Today, the criminal justice system provides numerous opportunities for citizens who face an injustice. Convictions can be vacated and expunged. That is why I think it is time to rein in pardon abuse. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and with me on the line, Matt Makoviak. I will just say a Texas political analyst extraordinaire. He knows all things Texas. He's been doing it a long time, and I would encourage you to go to his mustreadtexas.com blog to find out what's going on. Now, Matt, you mentioned the governor, and this is going to be an issue, as I understand it. Governor Abbott came into the pandemic. He shut things down for a few months, tried to start opening up. I think he tried to shut things down as little as possible, tried to open them back up as quickly as possible. He's been, some of the conservatives have been very, very critical of him and are interested in coming in and trying to, let's say, sort of make sure the legislature weighs in on these if we get another pandemic. That's understandable. I myself, given the fact that we didn't know what was going to happen in this, I never thought we would have had 400,000 deaths. I mean, when we were hitting 30, 40, 50,000, I thought that was probably going to be the top. So this is something we didn't know as much about, and we've learned as we go along. So I'm not nearly as critical as some people are. But what's your thoughts about the governor's handling of this, and whether or not there is some justification for the legislature coming in and trying to be able to weigh in if something like this happens again?
Yeah, I'm kind of where you are on that. I mean, I think that the governor did a reasonably good job under a very difficult circumstance. And at the end of the day, the executive branch has to be in charge. You know what I mean? I mean, the state legislature, the legislative branch, has oversight responsibility and has budget responsibility. But just like at the federal level, no one is saying Nancy Pelosi did something wrong with COVID or much do well. So the same is true at the state level. And so I understand the concerns about emergency powers. I don't have a kind of an ideological opposition to looking at it and seeing if smart changes can be made. Obviously, they're going to have to require the governor's signature, so I hope they're all doing it in a, collegial, way where they're working in a partnership. I do think if you had the governor on right now and you asked him what mistakes have you made in COVID, the one that he would identify is that he thinks that they opened the bars too early, that was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in retrospect, that's probably true, because if you think about it, bars are about getting together with other people. It's not about sitting down at a table and safely doing it at distance. It's about, walking around and saying hi to people. And if you're, single, maybe meeting someone. That's what bars are about. And so bars are just not set up with the kind of protections that restaurants are. Now, if you ask me, is it more dangerous drinking at a table in a bar or eating a meal in a restaurant in the COVID era? I think they're equally dangerous or equally not dangerous. But I do think that's probably the mistake that was made. And he admits that, and that's why he closed the bars down right away. Now, it's been very bad for bars.
Yeah.
Very bad. And I wish that they could reopen, these sectors. And we got to get back to it. I do think the other thing, Meryl, to mention is the vaccine deployment and administration has been really not great. Now, Texas is doing better than most states. I think we're at 1.7 million administered. We were the first state to hit 1 million. If anything, that's an indictment of California more than anything else. But I think your listeners probably understand it is very difficult, even if you qualify to get a vaccine right now. And that's a real shame. I do think it's going to get better over the next month, particularly as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires one dose, gets approved. But it's been a real mess. And so, yes, the legislature's going to look at emergency powers. We'll see where they end up on it.
Yeah, I think everybody will agree that mistakes were made. Having said that, when you move into something like this that you don't really understand, and even the science, the experts that the Democrats keep pointing to have changed and flipped on many of their recommendations and so forth, I give a politician a little bit of wiggle room for making mistakes on this.
Yeah, and look, as you said before, you got to remember we're in March. We didn't really know, much about the virus. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. We didn't know how it was going to affect the economy. We didn't know much about how contagious it was. We've learned a lot since then. In fact, a lot of what we knew then, we now know, maybe the opposite, right? Early on, they were saying, don't wear masks because the frontline professionals need PPE. There were all kinds of things that we thought we knew then that we now know differently. So I'm sensitive to people who are actually in positions of responsibility, who are surrounding themselves with experts, and the governor does that on the healthcare side with Dr. Hellerstedt from State Health Services, with Dr. Mark McClellan, an advisor who was a former FDA commissioner,
right,
and others. Dr. Zerwas, who's an advisor as well, and was a former state rep, well respected. So they were doing the best they could under a very difficult situation with lots of things changing in real time. There are some conservatives, Matt Rinaldi being one, a former state rep, who's just irate with Abbott and wants to reopen everything yesterday. I understand that instinct, but we have obviously had a resurgence of the virus in Texas, in our major markets, over the last few months. And until the vaccine gets us to close to herd immunity, it's going to be pretty hard to reopen, I think.
Let's talk a second about voter integrity. A lot of states, I think, are going to be looking at their voting process. Pennsylvania needs to look very closely at its voter process. And I suspect a lot of state legislatures are going to be trying to make some changes. Pennsylvania, of course, you had the problem with their state Supreme Court making some what I would call unconstitutional decisions. But having said that, I thought Texas did pretty well. I believe the Justice Department has seen some cases of fraud, a fairly small number, as I understand it. The last I saw was 120 or 30 or so in one particular area with nursing homes. What do you do you think the state's going to look at voter integrity? Anything that sort of weighs on your mind there?
Yeah, it's a great question because, there are a lot of people who maybe half the country, certainly a third of the country, looks at this last election and feels like there was a degree of voter fraud that was there. Now, it's absolutely clear at this point that the Trump legal team has not proven that case. And that's a shame because, I wish they had in a way. But if the case can't be made, then obviously you have to transition. And that's what happened yesterday or Tuesday with Wednesday yesterday with the inauguration. But the question you ask is the right one because you want voters to have confidence in the election. And when Pennsylvania goes from 200,000 mail ballots in 2016 to 2.5 million in 2020, and they implement the entire program in 2 months, it's entirely reasonable for a rational person to look at that and say, of course there was fraud. If they didn't purge their lists, if they didn't make sure people got them in places they weren't living at, if they didn't do signature verification, if they didn't do these things, and they probably didn't build these protections into place in 2 months, then there was almost surely fraud. So in Texas, the good news is our systems are better, and I think our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, deserves a lot of credit, because it's not that the Democrats didn't try to do what they did in Pennsylvania and the other states. They tried to do it in Texas. They just fought. The Attorney General defended the state's election laws and won on all lawsuits. I think he won 9 lawsuits. But Harris County wanted to send 1 million unsolicited mail ballots out. And I'll tell you right now, if that had happened, I think Biden would have won Texas. So you can imagine what that would have meant for the state house and for the congressional seats. So we do have to take on election integrity. I do believe it's going to be a priority for the legislative session. But this is where activists need to weigh in with their state reps and state senators and say, look, this is an issue you need to take seriously, and we're watching to see if you actually deliver on it.
You know, I think it was Jeb Bush who had a piece in the Wall Street Journal shortly after the election, and pointing out that when they had their problem in 2000 in Florida, they went through and they restructured everything, and they may have created a model there for voting, and you know, it was done very well. Nobody questions what happens with Florida, even though that went higher for Trump. And so I just it seems to me there ought to be a model out there that we can say, here's a good model. We ought to follow something like this, and we will ensure election integrity for the vast majority of people.
Absolutely. It's a great point, and I'm glad you pointed it out. Florida does a great job. And one of the things that Florida and Ohio both do that Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan don't do is Florida and Ohio both allow the counting of early votes before the polls close on election night. Mm-hmm. Why is that important? It's important because it allows them to basically issue almost 95% of their results within an hour when the polls close. And that builds confidence among the electorate. You know, when you go to bed on election night and Trump's ahead and you wake up and Trump's behind, whether it was legitimate or not, it is, understandable that millions of people would say, what happened? Particularly when those states said they weren't going to count anymore. Right? Now, I will say what happened is the mail ballots, which Biden dominated, came in for several days after the election, and that's why Biden won.
Right.
And so some of your listeners are going to doubt that. I understand that. Some of them may agree and understand it. Either way, we've got to get to a point where these states are all counting early votes ahead of time, and that's something only state legislatures can do. But that's not the only reform we need. We need to make sure ballot harvesting is never allowed. We need to make sure that mail ballots are done with good data, with purged data, because people move. We need to make sure dead people don't vote. We need to make sure people who leave the state don't vote. These are all really important things. Signature verification. All these things are really important. The good news is Texas is better than most places, but we can always be better.
In a lot of ways. My guest for this past segment has been Matt Mackowiak of Potomac Strategy Group in Austin. He knows all things Texas politics, so go and check on the mustreadtexas.com blog that he has there. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mail. Take care. Good to talk to you.
We're going to turn up to Minnesota next and the idea of COVID deaths, so stay with us here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And when we come back to the top, at the top of the hour, we're going to change directions and start looking at Section 230. That's the provision in the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which gave tech companies a certain pass on a liability protection on certain things. That has riled both the right and the left now. So we'll be talking with an expert on that then. But for this segment, we're going to be talking with Dr. Scott Jensen of Minnesota. He is a practicing physician, been doing this for a number of years. He's also a former Republican state senator in Minnesota. I think he just stepped down, didn't run for re-election, so he's just out of that office. And he's going to talk to us about COVID-19 deaths. Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be on your show.
Well, I want to thank Dave Racer, too, longtime friend of ours. He's in Minnesota, and he was able to connect us, and I've known David for probably 20 years now. And when he mentioned this, I said, we need to get Dr. Jensen on because this is an issue I've been talking about. And, of course, you sort of went to national fame or infamy, depending upon how you look at it, back in the spring when you raised some questions on Fox News about how they were counting COVID-19 deaths. Would you just run through a little bit of that history?
I'd be glad to. Essentially, at the very early part of April, I, as a practicing physician, received an email from the Minnesota Department of Health. And in that communication, toward the bottom of the page, it identified that when it comes to identifying COVID-19 as a cause of death, there were going to be new suggestions or instructions. And what they included was that if COVID-19 was considered to be a contributing condition, that it should be put down not in Part 2, where contributing conditions are listed, but it should be put down in Part 1, where the cause of death is listed. And this made no sense at all. It actually had the audacity in this communication to say that if other things, other disease entities such as emphysema or asthma were felt to be contributing conditions, they should be placed in the, if you will, minor part 2 as a contributing condition. But if it was COVID-19, put it in Part 1 as a cause of death. Then it had a link to the CDC, and in that, the CDC laid out several scenarios where COVID-19 would be the appropriate identified cause of death. And in one of the scenarios, it was a situation where there had been no laboratory confirmation test. There had been no test ordered. There had been no test considered. So I was troubled by this deeply, and I said, why would we do this? The outcome would be obvious. We would be corrupting the quality of data we have. We would be, if you will, abandoning the normal process of identifying a precise initiating event that led to a sequence of steps that culminated in a person's death. That's what we normally do, and I've been doing for 35 years. So I cried foul, and I said, no, this doesn't make sense. What are we trying to do here? And so that was ramped up and ultimately found on national TV. And then another question came up to me, and it was, well, why would there potentially be this kind of encouragement? And I said, well, certainly fear paralyzes the ability of people to think for themselves, but it also frequently will somehow or another circle back to dollars. And then I shared with the audience that stepping aside from death certificates, if you simply looked at discharge summaries from hospitalizations, if COVID-19 were a part of the healthcare the patient received during hospitalization, there'd be a significant bump upwards in terms of what the hospital might get paid if it was a Medicare patient. And that caused people to be pretty riled up.
And you were absolutely right. And I actually wrote something at the time defending you on that, because the USA Today had a piece in there which discussed this, and I think they went to quote some people from the American Medical Association or something, saying this is outrageous, saying that doctors would be falsifying death certificates and so forth. And you never said that. I mean, what you were simply saying was the guidance gave a certain flexibility, and the finances behind that, especially when hospitals were on lockdown, couldn't do elective surgeries and things of that nature, and many hospitals might be hurting. You had, if you're a doctor and you say, well, there may be COVID, but we don't have the test yet. We're not entirely sure. We've got too much to do to take the time to do that anyway. It looks like some COVID symptoms, but there might have been pneumonia or flu or something else. But there's an economic incentive to do that. If you're a doctor and you think it's reasonable to put that down as a cause, there's no fraud there. I suspect as doctors you're sometimes not entirely sure, or you think there might be several causes, and so you're just making your best guess.
Merrill, you said that better than I could. If anybody in this country had an understanding of what you just said, my life would have been a whole lot easier the last 10 months. If physicians would have been honest enough with themselves to recognize the validity of what you just shared. We're not talking about accusing someone of fraud. We're talking about situations that are squishy at times. I remember one of the first times I was challenged by a coding clerk in a hospital, whereby they said, well, could you list dehydration above diarrhea instead of the other way around? Because if you do, we'll get paid more. And I said, well, it doesn't matter to me. I mean, the diarrhea caused the dehydration. The dehydration is why I had to admit the patient for IV fluids. Yeah, they're both part and parcel of it. I can list them both, and it doesn't really matter to me in this situation what the order would be. And I don't think I was doing anything fraudulent. I was simply, yeah, okay. And I think most physicians want their hospitals to flourish. And like you said, hospitals were getting shut down tremendously. And what we didn't know at that time, that we've learned since, is that the CARES Act dollars that were being distributed actually did ultimately reward heavily anybody any hospital that was able to get to 160 COVID admissions between January 1st and June 10th got a spiff payment of $77,000 per admission on top of what they'd already gotten paid for these COVID patients. So all of a sudden, like in Minnesota, I think we had like 10 hospital systems got a chance to participate in those dollars. The hundreds and hundreds of other hospitals didn't get that. But dollars have absolutely participated in the process of what's going on. And to deny that fact is at some level sort of righteously sticking your head in the sand and saying, aren't I wonderful?
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but different countries attribute deaths differently in their coding. My sense is different states and perhaps even different counties sometimes stress this or that or the other, so that it's not necessarily. And this isn't trying to say it's a wild game, but it's just not. There's some variations across countries and even across this country. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. It's a very fair assessment, and I think for me, I have received an onslaught of requests for information, emails, responses from around the world, helping people asking, how do you do it? I remember getting one conversation from someone in Warsaw, Poland, and they said, we're trying to figure it out here, and we generally would like to take the lead from what America does because you make a lot of sense in America, but this doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't.
I agree with you on that. And incidentally, I have looked over the communication on guidance for certifying deaths due to coronavirus disease, the one that came out in April. I'm holding it up for our viewers online to see. It's a small document, and I highlighted some things back there, and I pulled it back up so they can go and look at it. And they give you a lot of wiggle room on doing that in order to be able to make some kind of determination as to what as to what's happening. And the result is, and we've got about a little over a minute left, but the the result is you could end up having higher COVID deaths. And there may be some cases in which we're undercounting COVID deaths, but at least because of the financial incentives. And I notice, Doctor, when liberals are out looking at a business person or something, they always come up and say, follow the money, follow the money. But when it came up to the COVID death rate, they didn't seem to want to look at that very closely.
No, then we heard that mantra, follow the science, follow the science. And I'll that.
And it was interesting how often the science changed behind this. And I'm not too critical of Dr. Fauci on that, but as you know, they ridiculed masks in January and February. Then by the end of March, early April, masks were something you really needed to wear. And then by May or June, it was you absolutely have to wear a mask. We ought to have a mandate to have a mask out there. My guest for this segment is Dr. Scott Jensen. He is a practicing physician, former state senator in Minnesota, and we're talking about COVID-19 deaths. If you want to find out a little more about him, you can go to pointofview.net. And when we come back, I think there's another state legislator there in Minnesota who has been looking at this and actually doing a deep dive. And we want to talk a little bit about that with my guest, Dr. Scott Jensen. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. My guest for this remaining segment, Dr. Scott Jensen, a practicing family physician in Minnesota and a former state senator for the state. And Dr. Jensen, I've got something here because Dave Racer that I mentioned earlier had done a little interview with Minnesota State Rep Mary Franson, and he sent me a part of that interview, and I'm just going to read a little part of this. He says, recently Representative Franson retrieved 2,800 death certificates from the state of Minnesota Department of Health that indicate COVID-19 as cause of death. What she has already discovered could change the way that the world looks at COVID-19 deaths. With the help of others, guided by Senator Jensen, learned hand and medically trained mind, Representative Franson's research and analysis shows that perhaps 40% of deaths attributed to COVID-19 are wrongly reported. Some of those deaths shown on COVID-19 as COVID-19 caused on the death certificate, she explained, are only presumed by officials to be COVID-19 cause. Now, explain to us a little bit about what's going on here. She apparently is looking at death certificates, and she's seeing perhaps other things that are involved there. Give us the background on this.
Well, Representative Franson called me after she had received this tranche of data and asked me for some help. So basically, I reviewed with her how a death certificate is completed. And I think what's most important for folks to understand is that death certificate, from my perspective as a physician, has two parts, 1 and 2. 2 is where contributing conditions are listed, and generally they are not considered a cause of death, like uncontrolled diabetes, maybe morbid obesity, perhaps a previous cancer, something like that. But part 1 is where it all matters. And part 1 has multiple lines, A, B, C, D, and they go downward. And generally, the underlying cause of death, which is the real cause of death, according to the CDC, is the lowest line completed. So if you complete 4 lines, A, B, C, and D, the lowest line would be D. And whatever that diagnosis code is would be the cause of death. And then that would have led to something else, which would have led to something else, which would have led to something. So let's take a quick example. Let's just say I have a heart attack today, and tomorrow I have an angiogram and I get a stent. And 2 months from now I get congestive heart failure. And 2 months later, I get pneumonia and I die. Mm-hmm. And basically, I just got sicker and sicker during the course of this 4 or 5 months. Mm-hmm. The top line diagnosis, which would be the immediate cause of death in line A, would be pneumonia. Due to or a consequence of congestive heart failure would be on line B. Mm-hmm. Due to or as a consequence of C would be heart attack. Due to or as a consequence of D, which would be the underlying cause of death, the bottom line filled out, and it would say coronary artery disease, or you could say atherosclerosis. Mm-hmm. Regardless, these are almost interchangeable. But the bottom line is the underlying cause of death would have been a cardiovascular diagnosis, and I would have been one of the 650,000 Americans that die every year from cardiovascular disease. That's what we were looking at. So what Representative Franson did was went through all of the claimed COVID deaths from the Department of Health and said, which ones on the underlying cause of death line don't have COVID or a COVID-like diagnosis. So it didn't say COVID, it didn't say probable COVID, it might have said drowning, or it might have said heart failure, or it might have said stage 4 colon cancer. And in that process, she found that I can't remember the exact numbers because I looked at a different set of data about a month or two later, perhaps a month, and found that 25% inflation had occurred. But I think her data initially showed a 40% inflationary factor. But this is what she was doing, is saying, let's understand this. And there's 2 ways to make an error. One is to call it a COVID death when the underlying cause of death isn't COVID. And 2 is to put in the underlying cause of death line COVID when it was clearly not. Like if it was drowning. If a person has COVID and they drown, they died of the drowning. They didn't die of COVID. In that situation, you would put COVID as, if you wanted to, a contributing condition, but it has no place in the sequence of the events that caused the death. Does that make sense?
It does. And to be clear to our listeners, we're not saying that the COVID death rate isn't high. I mean, I think we've just crossed over the official statistic. It's 400,000. It's been tragic and much higher than I would have thought back in the spring. But having said that, there is a question as to whether or not the number that we're looking at may be inflated a little bit. In some cases, it may be undercounted because of they didn't know that COVID was underneath there. Or they might have thought it was a flu or something of that nature. Earlier cases, they may have thought it was the flu or pneumonia, and they didn't have the COVID test. So we're not sort of disputing the gravity of this issue. It's just it's not entirely clear that all the deaths that are being counted are necessarily COVID. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think that it points to the fact that there's a lot of data that we're going to come across that's not going to be as reliable or factual. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what can we really lean into? Well, what we should really lean into is confirmed cases. We actually should be looking at death counts, because death counts are less easily massaged. But those deaths should have laboratory confirmation with them, even though the testing we do for laboratory confirmation is fraught with copious numbers of false positives.
We've got about 3 minutes left, so let me ask you the question. Is there a good solution here? Is this something that the federal government needs to address at the CDC, or is this something states need to address? What would be a reasonable solution, given the fact that we don't always know on some of these?
That's a great question. I think the most reasonable solution is to go ahead and do an audit and have someone nonpartisan, maybe 4 or 5 PhD candidates, and basically it'll take them about an hour to understand how death certificates are to be completed, and then go through the death certificates and identify which ones appear to be COVID deaths and document them accordingly and take out the fluff. Because one of the things that's happening is we're not comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges. We have some states, if you look at what happened in Minnesota, because our biggest surge in both cases and deaths occurred in the fall, we're not going to be treated the same way as some of the eastern states like New Jersey and New York, who had their biggest issues in March and April. They received a huge chunk of money from the CARES Act if they were able to hit 160 COVID admissions to the hospital. They're getting paid for that. Minnesota isn't going to be, because those dollars aren't available. They're not being stretched out. We really have allowed winners and losers to emerge in this process of distorted, corrupted data. And that's why I think we should just have audits. All states should initiate them, and we should try to collate this, and we should say, let's quit with the politicking. Let's try to get good, honest data, and let's move on.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jensen, for highlighting this. I mean, when I saw you pop up on national news back in the spring, I thought, well, this is really interesting. I went and looked at some of the things you were saying, and you were absolutely right on this. And of course, the media were just, I have very little regard for the media on many of these things anymore, because they just so distort what people say. But thank you so much for joining us. And if our listeners want to know more about you, we can go to pointofview.net. We have some information up there about Dr. Jensen. Thank you for your service, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
And when we come back, I'm excited about this. We're going to be talking about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That was something passed back in 1996. It has become a flashpoint for both liberals and conservatives. Both of them want to do something about this. Is there a good remedy? Can we do something about this effectively? It's not entirely clear that the solution or any remedy actually fixes the problem and would be better than what we have right now. So we're going to come back with Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, talking about Section 230. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. Stay with us on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And in this hour, we're going to take on an issue that has become a flashpoint for both the political right and the political left. We're talking about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which passed, I believe, in 1996, so it's about 25 years old. But we've got a situation that has arisen where both the right and the left are very critical of Section 230. And with the right saying it's allowing big tech companies to censor conservative thought, and the left saying it's not, these big tech companies aren't censoring enough. So we want to go to an expert on this. My guest for this hour by phone, Tom Giovanetti. He's president of the Institute for Policy Innovation and a colleague of mine. He's been working on this issue for some time, and IPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. It's been around for a little over 30 years, and we work on just a range of different issues, from tax policy to technology policy, intellectual property, health policy, just a range of different things. And Tom covers the tech policy, among other things. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. You're right. I mean, tech has gone from being the sweethearts and the darlings of American society to being the big hated enemy right now.
It has on both sides. It's fascinating to see how this has developed. So take us back and give us a little history about Section 230, and so that people have an understanding of what was intended, why it was included, and what we've seen from it.
I'm glad you want to do that, because I think that the key to understanding Section 230 and the existing legal regime we have right now for social media platforms is, in fact, the history. It's why these laws were written in the first place. And a lot of times I find that people who are describing Section 230, they describe it incorrectly, and they describe it incorrectly in part because they don't understand the history. So we have to go back to the before times. We have to go back to ancient history, as you said, about 25 years ago, when there was no such thing as social media platforms. Twitter didn't exist. Facebook didn't exist. YouTube did not exist. None of these companies existed. And so what you had were what were called bulletin board services. You had companies like CompuServe and Prodigy and other kinds of companies like that, where people would simply post online chats and content. They were mostly text-based. I'm old enough to have been both a participant in CompuServe and Prodigy. And what you had going on in those days on these bulletin board services is human nature being what it is. Occasionally, some bad things would get posted on these services. You would have people posting defamatory content where they were falsely accusing people of doing bad things. You would have doxing, although the term had not been invented yet, but you would have people harassing people online and posting their home addresses and their telephone numbers and encouraging people to harass them. You had people posting pornography on these bulletin board services and other kinds of obscene material. You had people making violent threats on these bulletin board services. So that kind of thing went on long before there was such a thing as social media, just because it comes out of the unfortunate darkness of the human heart. It doesn't come from technology. And so the first thing that happened is that CompuServe was sued for allowing defamatory material to be posted on their bulletin board. CompuServe had a policy of not blocking or filtering anything. CompuServe said, we're going to be just a free speech platform. We're going to let anything go. And so someone posted some defamatory content on CompuServe, and the person that was defamed, the company that was defamed, sued CompuServe, and they won. I'm sorry, wait, I've got this backwards. I apologize. I'm confusing the two cases. And they lost. And the reason they lost, the court found that because CompuServe did not filter, they were not responsible because they were a neutral platform, because they didn't filter, because they didn't review any of the content, they were just a pipeline, then they were not liable. So that was the first legal precedent here. But then 3 years later, you had another bulletin board service called Prodigy. And Prodigy had a different policy. Prodigy did filter and block objectionable content. And there was a lawsuit against Prodigy. The same sort of thing happened. Somebody sued Prodigy for defamatory postings that made it onto the site, and the courts found that Prodigy was liable because Prodigy did filter their content. So you had these two legal decisions that if a bulletin board service did not filter and block, they would not be liable, but if they did filter and block, they would be liable. So here's the problem. The reaction to those two law cases was that bulletin board services said, we really cannot afford to moderate our content because that makes us liable. And when Congress saw this happening, Congress says, we can't allow this to become the regime. We don't want the internet to become nothing but a platform filled with pornography and defamatory material and obscene material and threats of violence and things like that. There was a conservative Democrat Christian senator named Senator James Exon from Nebraska, and he introduced a bill called the Communications Decency Act, the CDA. And the purpose of his bill was to clean up the internet, was to make sure that the internet was not just essentially a cesspool. And remember, these are the early days of the internet, again, before these social media platforms even existed. So the purpose of the Communications Decency Act was to protect children and to clean up the internet. There was an amendment that was filed to the Communications Decency Act, and that amendment is what is now called Section 230. And what that amendment did was it said, we want platforms, we want to encourage them to moderate because we're trying to clean up the internet. We're trying to keep it safe. And so because of these legal precedents that had been set, Congress had to step in, and Congress had to say, we want internet platforms to moderate their content. We want them to pull the weeds out of their garden when the weeds spring up. And so what we're going to say is, if you moderate your content, you will not be legally liable just because you moderate your content. So essentially, Section 230 reversed the Supreme Court's Prodigy decision that made platforms legally liable for all content if they blocked or moderated any of it.
My guest for this hour is Tom Giovanetti. He's president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We have a link at pointofview.net if you want to find out more about IPI or Tom Giovanetti, or sign up for the various publications that IPI sends out. We're talking about Section 230. When we come back, we're going to find out about what's happened since they passed 230 and how that has managed to allow the internet to just sort of explode and become a great place for innovation. So stay with us. We're going to be back with just a minute with Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, talking about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
As even school children know, the British monarchy preceded the American Republic. The framers wanted to change many aspects of their previous government, so they wrote in Article 6 of the Constitution that no title of nobility should be granted by the federal government. But in other areas, they continued the British tradition of the king. One example is in Article 2 that grants the president the power to grant pardons. The framers justified it in a way to restore peace and tranquility. And it certainly provided some of that when clemency was given to Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. But so often the pardon power of the presidency has been misused. President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, hoping to move the nation past the Watergate crisis. It probably cost him the election with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter pardoned nearly 200,000 Vietnam draft dodgers. Perhaps the greatest abuse of the pardon power came from Bill Clinton, who pardoned convicted terrorists with the Weather Underground, along with Patty Hearst, who joined a domestic terrorist group. The pardon most people remember is the pardon he gave to Mark Rich, a racketeer, in large part because of his donations to the Clinton Library and other Democratic candidates. We may appreciate some of the pardons President Trump gave to people like Dinesh D'Souza and Michael Flynn, but he also pardoned Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Charles Kushner, father of Jared Kushner. And since I'm writing this before Donald Trump has left office, the list may include many other pardons for other questionable recipients. Today, the criminal justice system provides numerous opportunities for citizens who face an injustice. Convictions can be vacated and expunged. That is why I think it is time to rein in pardon abuse. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And my guest for this hour is Tom Giovanetti. He's the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we're talking about this flashpoint that has emerged among tech companies, Section 230. So, Tom, they passed Section 230 as part of the Communications Decency Act in 1996. What does it say, and has it worked?
Yeah, let me make one more mention about the history because it's really important.
Sure.
Because so again, we've mentioned that Section 230 was an amendment to the Communications Decency Act. So that's the language that says Section 230 is actually Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The day that the Communications Decency Act was signed into law, the ACLU, the civil rights group, filed a legal challenge claiming that it was unconstitutional. And that case worked its way all the way through the courts, and it got all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1997, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court struck down the Communications Decency Act. They said it violated the First Amendment restrictions on free speech. So Senator Exxon's attempts to keep the Internet clean hinged on words like indecency and obscenity and things like that. And the Supreme Court has been pretty consistent in recent decades in saying that when you try to ban something like that, that's a violation of the First Amendment, because no one's really able to determine and define where the lines are between something that's obscene and indecent, et cetera, et cetera. So the Communications Decency Act was thrown out by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruled that Section 230 could remain, that it was severable. So almost all of the Communications Decency Act was thrown out, but Section 230 was retained. So that's the only part of it that survived into law today. Now, when you understand that history, and the history, of course, being the idea that if we don't allow Internet platforms to moderate, they will become flooded with all sorts of objectionable material. If you understand that rationale for Section 230, that leads you to believe that Section 230 or something like it is very, very important, and that it is delusional to think that an online platform could take a absolute free speech, Wild West, no holds barred approach. Because what immediately happens in those cases is the platform gets flooded by all sorts of inappropriate material. Defamation, copyright violations, slander, libel, threats of violence, obscenity and pornography, et cetera, et cetera. That's just what happens if you don't moderate. And so that's why we have a Section 230 to say to Internet platforms, we encourage you to moderate, we encourage you to pull the weeds out of your garden so that people can have a good online experience. Now, Section 230 does not instruct platforms how they're supposed to moderate, and that's a good thing, because as conservatives and as believers in the free market, we don't want government dictating how everything is supposed to be run and how everything is supposed to be done. So different Internet platforms choose different ways to filter and moderate. They choose different means. YouTube, for instance, has a system of child protection where parents can literally go into their child's YouTube account and they can put in parental controls. And that blocks certain kinds of videos off of YouTube, but it lets others through. Facebook and Twitter and platforms like that have decided that they will rely on a reporting system where if someone reports a post or a tweet or something like that as objectionable, it will get reviewed. And then they also set up automatic filters that are looking for certain words, certain phrases, certain kinds of language that is threatening or indecent or something like that. Now, the problem that these platforms have is that the volume of user-generated content is so enormous. I mean, just think, Facebook has over 1 billion users, over 1 billion users. So there's not enough human beings to review every post that is made and to decide whether or not it's acceptable. And I don't think we would want that anyway. I think that it makes way more sense to rely on some sort of a filtering and reporting system. But of course, no system is perfect. And so this gets us sort of to where the real conflict is right now, is you have both the left and the right in politics who are angry at these social media platforms. The conservatives are absolutely certain that Facebook and Twitter are discriminating against them. And the left, liberals, are absolutely convinced that Facebook, at least, was involved in some sort of a secret cabal with Russia to get Donald Trump elected. And so neither side is happy with the way this filtering and blocking is being done. And I have to say, as a user of these platforms, I'm not happy with it either. I do see what I think is discriminatory blocking. I think that debates about abortion, debates about homosexuality, debates about climate change, debates about transgenderism and things like that, those are legitimate debates. Those are legitimate points of discussion. And if a platform decides that just by its very nature, any post about transgenderism, for instance, is somehow bigoted and gets blocked, I disagree with that decision that they make. But the real question is, are we better off with government mandating from the top down to these platforms how they should moderate? And again, as a conservative, as a free market guy, as a believer in the market, I have to say that usually when government steps in and tries to run things, they make it worse, not better.
Is it fair to say that that Section 230 worked pretty well for a while, and that this is the real tension right now is over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, since in the 25 years since it was initially put in place, or has it been a real tension since the beginning?
It really only started with the debut of social media. And if you think about it, we've only had social media for about 8 or 10 years. And so let's back up and talk about what we mean when we say social media, because this is an important distinction. What we're really talking about is user-generated content. So when the first websites came along, it was newspapers, magazines, things like that. These were traditional publishers who were simply publishing on the internet. But then with the rise of social media, you actually had user-generated content where anybody can upload a video to YouTube, anybody can tweet, anybody can put a post on Facebook. There's no decision up front whether or not to allow it. And this turns out to be a really big deal. This choosing what to publish and choosing what to block are not the same thing. And preemptively deciding shall we or shall we not allow this to be published is very different than then going back after the fact and saying, should we block this? So should we publish this and should we block this are not the same thing. They're very different things. And I tend to think of it in terms of like there's a difference between planting crops on a farm and pulling weeds. They're not the same thing. The farmer purposely plants certain kinds of crops. He makes the decision what to plant, and that's sort of like publishing. But then he also has to come back regularly and pull the weeds. And that is, in my view, sort of a good analog for going back and blocking objectionable content. Now, an easy way to think about the difference between what is published and what is user-generated content is to think about a website like the New York Times or the Washington Post or National Review or something like that, and the comments section. So you'll have an article that the New York Times or National Review decided to publish. Someone sent them an article, someone sent them an op-ed, and they reviewed it, and they made the decision, yes, we will publish this. They're responsible for that as a publisher. And if there's anything in that material that is objectionable or defamatory or something, they're legally liable. They're subject to get sued for that. But the comments section, where just anybody can just fire off an opinion or spam or something like that, that's user-generated content. That was not published by the publisher. That's something that just some user decided to put up there. And the real question is, why on earth should, for instance, National Review magazine be legally liable for some comment that some nut job posted in the comment section? That doesn't make any sense at all. They're responsible for what they choose to publish, but why would they be responsible for user-generated content? And, as conservatives, we're believers in individual responsibility.
My guest for this hour is Tom Giovanetti of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We're talking about Section 230. If you'd have a comment or a question for Tom, you can call at 1-800-351-1212. We'll open the phone lines, 1-800-351-1212. Stay with us on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question or a comment for Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, we're talking about Section 230 that has become such a flashpoint lately. Tom, tell us a little bit about what happened with Parler, because as the rage has grown over the social media platforms, Parler came up here recently and said, "Well, we're going to be an open site. We're going to let people come in and say whatever they want to." And then next thing you know, Apple took their app off the Apple website. And Amazon, which is I believe one of the largest providers of cloud service, decided to shut them down as well. What was happening with Parler?
So Parler came into existence because of this frustration with Facebook and Twitter and the way they were blocking and filtering content, and in particular for conservatives and people sort of on the right side of the political aisle. And so Parler's big deal was, we're going to be a free speech platform. We're not going to block. We're not going to moderate. You can come here and you can have confidence that you'll be able to say anything you want to say, and we won't block it. So what happened was a large number of conservatives flocked over there, especially those who were in the habit of having their content blocked and filtered by Twitter and Facebook. And so all of a sudden, the next thing you know, Parler is filled with threats of violence and defamation and objectionable material and things like that. And so when Apple looked at the kind of stuff that was showing up on Parler, Apple said, we don't want this kind of stuff in our app store. And so Apple removed them. So the Parler experience is proof of what I was trying to explain earlier, which is you can't be a completely free speech, unmoderated platform. You just can't do it because of human nature. You end up getting flooded with horrible stuff. Now, there's good stuff too, but a whole lot of horrible, objectionable stuff. And so that's what happened to Parler. And so now, of course, Parler is saying, oh, we'll moderate. So again, the lesson here is, because of human nature being what it is, and because there are people out there who are violent, who are mean, who will threaten, who will post pornography and things like that, social media platforms have to moderate. They have no choice if they want to actually exist. They have to moderate. And for most of your listeners who are Christians or who at least buy into the Judeo-Christian worldview, this should not be a surprise, because we do believe that there's something wrong with human nature. And we do know that human nature very often reflects itself in a negative way. And so you would expect that to show up in social media, and that's what happens. So these platforms, they have to block and they have to moderate. Now, as we said earlier, there's lots of people who are unhappy about the way they're doing it, and they think the solution is to force platforms somehow to be neutral, to force them to not moderate and to not block content. And if any listener has been listening to this conversation so far and paid attention to the history and everything, then you should understand why that simply isn't going to work. If you were to remove Section 230, these social media platforms would absolutely have to tighten down on their moderation. They would have to dramatically increase the amount of blocking of content that they do, because they can't go the other direction. Because if they go the other direction and they're legally liable, they'll be legally liable for every threat, every defamation, every doxing, every piece of child porn that makes its way onto their platform, every bit of online harassment that makes it onto their platform. They would become legally liable. And so you may not be totally thrilled with your experience right now on social media, but if you get rid of Section 230, you'll like it even less, because there will be a dramatic increase in moderation, filtering, and blocking. And I want to touch on a couple of points I think that are worth repeating.
Okay.
I mentioned just before the last break this idea of individual responsibility. I mean, this is something conservatives passionately believe in. We believe in individual responsibility. If I post something horrible on Facebook, why on earth should Facebook be legally liable for that? That makes no sense. I should be liable for that. I should be the one. If I defame someone on Twitter or Facebook, I'm the one that should be sued. I'm the one that should be punished, not the platform. They didn't do it. They didn't defame anybody. So if you believe in individual responsibility, this idea of making the platforms legally liable for what their users post makes no sense. And the other thing that will happen, of course, this will be a boon to the trial lawyers. So if you really, really like trial lawyers, and if you really, really like our litigious society, get rid of Section 230, because there will be an entire industry of trial lawyers who do nothing but sue the social media platforms all day long.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Tom Giovanetti about Section 230. You know, Tom, I was listening on National Public Radio a few days ago, and a spokesperson for Parler was on there discussing, and this was after Amazon and Apple had sort of shut them down, and I think she was talking about Apple, if I remember correctly, but she said, we've been in discussion with them since back in the fall about how we were trying to do this, because as I understood her, she said Parler has volunteer judges, I think she called them judges, that they would say questionable stuff would go over, and the volunteer would then look at this and make some kind of determination. So she said we had these volunteers who were doing this, but we were getting so overwhelmed with new people coming on that they just couldn't keep up with it. And so she said we were trying to talk to them, and I think she said they had just initially had started implementing some artificial intelligence, some computer screeners that were sort of going through this, and then all of a sudden Apple and Amazon come up and cut them off. But I point that out because, as I understood her, this wasn't something that just happened overnight. She had, in fact, and Parler had been in discussions with them for several weeks before something was actually taken, because Apple must have been trying to say, look, we see this as a problem, you need to address it, and maybe Parler was trying to, but not sufficiently.
Yeah, I think Parler's response was insufficient and naive. Look, human moderation is not scalable. I mean, once you start to get a lot of people moving to your platform, there's just not enough human beings, and there's not enough time of day to look at every post and review it before it goes up. You just can't do it that way. So Parler was playing a game. They were doing what every tech company does. They were trying to get essentially, a bunch of early adoption and get a bunch of flooded with people. And, there's an ethic in Silicon Valley, get market share first and fix the problems later. And I think that's what Parler was doing. They said, hey, come on over. It's going to be free speech. Nobody's going to be blocked. And then they found out really quick, oh, golly, we actually do have to filter. We do have to block. But as the problem got bigger and bigger, they just got overwhelmed, and they weren't able to scale up fast enough. If Parler's to succeed, I mean, I hate to break it to you, but if Parler's to succeed, they have to become more like Twitter and Facebook. They have to rely on algorithms, and they have to rely on artificial intelligence to filter and block and screen, because there's just not enough human beings to do it. Now, really what people are frustrated about, I mean, this whole discussion that you and I have had so far, I think you and I have probably found it interesting because we're policy nerds, right? But really what people are upset about is the belief that these social media platforms are run by a bunch of hippies and teenagers in Silicon Valley who don't share our worldview. And so it is inherent in the system that conservatives are going to get discriminated against. Now, for purposes of this discussion, let's just say that's probably right. Okay, let's grant that. Let's say that's probably right, that conservatives are not going to get a fair deal from social media. So I have a couple thoughts on that. First of all, since when did conservatives ever get a fair deal from anybody, or from the media or anything like that? I mean, we're always the ones who are being discriminated against, so there's nothing new about that. But the real question is, okay, so what's the alternative? The only alternative that anyone has come up with is either abolishing Section 230 or creating some sort of speech regulation, some sort of fairness or neutrality regulations for Internet platforms. Now, we've already discussed that if you eliminate Section 230, there'll be more blocking, not less. So let's focus for a moment on this idea of speech regulation.
I'll tell you what, let's come back after our break and we'll focus on the idea of speech regulation. My guest for the remaining segment of this hour, Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We're talking about Section 230, 1-800-351-1212. If you want to get in a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment with Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we're talking about Section 230. At the top of the hour, we're going to change gears and talk about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. President Biden has said he does not want to go to a single-payer system, what we call a Bernie Sanders Medicare for All system. He wants to improve Obamacare. That's going to be a stiff challenge, improving Obamacare. So we're going to talk to Chris Jacobs about that and see if he has some suggestions about what we do. Tom, we've got some callers on the line. Let's go to Keith in Georgia and see if he can, if I can get this open. We've got a new system up here. Keith, are you on the air? I don't have Keith. Okay. All right. Do we have Keith on the air? All right. We've got a new system here, and I'm trying to make it work. Tom, while we're doing that, go ahead and finish your thoughts that we had just before we went on.
Oh, sure. So we talked about, I tried to explain why eliminating Section 230 will result in something worse than what we have now. The other thing that people talk about is having some sort of neutrality regulations on platforms, some sort of federal law. This is platforms cannot discriminate against political speech based on party or whatever. The problem with that is that we've had that before, and it was a disaster. We used to have something called the Fairness Doctrine that applied to broadcast media, that required broadcast media to equally reflect both sides and to give equal time and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And it was a disaster. And so when Ronald Reagan's administration got rid of it, that was the moment that conservative talk radio blossomed. That was the moment that the Rush Limbaughs and Sean Hannity's and Mark Levin's and your favorite local conservative talk show host, that's when they became possible. And that's why Fox News is possible, because of getting rid of the Fairness Doctrine. So when we had a fairness law that applied to broadcast media, it made it impossible for conservatives to break into media. So we don't want to make that same mistake on online platforms and on the internet that we once made on broadcast media. So while we may not, I guess my overall recommendation to folks would be this: while we may not like the way things are working right now on social media, this might be the best possible regime. It may be that any other regime, whether it's some sort of federal speech regulations or whether it's getting rid of Section 230, is probably going to result in something that you like much less than the status quo. Those of us who believe in free markets don't believe free markets are perfect. We just think they're better than the alternative.
Good. Let's go to Keith in Georgia now. Keith, you're on the air.
Hey, have you got me this time?
We did.
Hey, I thought I'd been Section 230.
Go right ahead.
Hey, just a quick note on the Section 230 and the way it's been treated. I think the majority of the people on the right, and I can speak for myself, I don't necessarily have a problem with Section 230 in that fact of platforms monitoring for inappropriateness. But I think it's being, I think it's hypocritical the way that they're doing it, and they're not monitoring both equally. They got rid of Parler, if you want to talk Apple or Amazon or whoever, pulled the plug on them, but under the pretense that there was violence being perpetrated on it. But, you know, Black Lives Matter Antifa has long used Facebook and Twitter to, you know, communicate their violence, their rioting, and it's just, it's not even-handed, and it's hypocrisy for Facebook or Twitter to silence one side, but yet allow the other side, the other voice to be heard.
It's a good point, Keith. Tom?
I think Keith is exactly right. I do think that the sentiment he just expressed represents the feelings of a whole lot of people out there. And this is what I meant when I said that conservatives feel like they're being discriminated against, that they're not being treated equally and fairly. And I think that's undeniable. I mean, even if we look at the way the media treated what happened in the Capitol on January 6th compared to all of the BLM riots and vandalism and burning and destruction, it's very clear that the conservatives and people on the right do actually get discriminated against and treated differently. It's like there's a double standard. And so I'm not denying that. I think Keith is right, and I think what Keith just expressed is what an awful lot of conservatives are feeling right now. My point is simply that I don't think that there's a way that you can solve that problem through law or regulation. That if you try to address that problem through either law or regulation, you're going to end up with something that is even more unfair and even worse than what we're experiencing right now.
That takes us to a question that Jimmy has, and we've talked about this, we haven't today, but the issue of monopolies, because there is legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act, that tries to let us regulate monopolies some. Jimmy, you're on the air.
Yeah, that was my question. It was interesting to hear about the Section 230. I was really glad to hear that because that gave me a better picture. But monopolies, I mean, there's laws on the books to get rid of monopolies. I think Google, Twitter, Facebook, they definitely have monopolies. And I'm a big believer in the free market system, but the free market includes competition. And if competition could be implemented, I think that would help solve a lot of these problems.
Tom, you've got about 2 minutes left to talk about the monopolies.
So between Jimmy and Keith, they have both expressed the two major complaints people have about social media right now. And Jimmy's complaint is essentially what we tend to hear from the left and from Democrats, which is that these platforms are too big, they're too powerful, they're monopolies. The interesting thing is that U.S. monopoly law, U.S. antitrust law, says the following. It says that the real test of whether a company is being abusive and abusing its market share is called the consumer welfare standard. Are they using their market power to harm consumers, or are they using their market power to benefit consumers? We don't have any law on the books in the United States that says once a company gets so big, we need to automatically break them up. The question is always, are consumers being benefited or are consumers being harmed? And the thing about social media is it's free. So you get all the benefits of Facebook, you get all the benefits from Twitter or Parler or Pinterest or YouTube. You get all those benefits for free. So the overall impact of these social media platforms on consumers is that they deliver tremendous benefit at no cost. So there's no justification in U.S. law for breaking these platforms up unless they could be proven to be harming rather than helping consumers. And according to the consumer welfare standard, it's really impossible to argue that they're harming rather than helping consumers.
My guest for this hour has been Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. You can find out more about him by going to pointofview.net. We have a bio up there of him and contact information, or you can go to IPI.org and you can find all the information that's available there. We publish a number of things. It's all available free. IPI is a non-profit, nonpartisan research institute, and so you're free to go there and just find the material, read it, share it, however you want to. Thank you, Tom, so much for joining us.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me.
And when we come back, we're going to change over to the health care issue, because now that we know Joe Biden is president, we're not worrying so much about Medicare for all, Bernie Sanders' proposal, or are we? Maybe we are. We'll talk to Chris Jacobs when we come back here on Point of View. Stay with us.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary, because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to our final hour of Point of View. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we're going to focus now on the health care issue. It's going to be big coming up here in the Biden administration. He wants to essentially improve Obamacare, which he, of course, was part of the administration that passed that legislation. He's pushed aside notions that we go to a single-payer health care system like Bernie Sanders and many on the far left want to go to, and we'll see if they're going to be successful in that. I mean, I think it's something of an open shot right now as to what actually happens on this, especially given the divided Congress. My guest for this hour by phone is Chris Jacobs. He is the founder and CEO of Juniper Research Group and the author of the book, The Case Against Single Payer. He was on Capitol Hill for a number of years and worked for a number of committees. He was on the Senate Republican, Joint Economic Committee for the Senate Republican staff. He worked as an advisor to the House Republican Conference under then Chairman Mike Pence, and he's been working on health policy for a number of years and still does. And Chris and I go back a long time. Back when he was on Capitol Hill, he would write a regular, I think it was daily if I remember right, a short email about what was happening on the healthcare reform issues. It was must read for many of the people who were interested in health policy. We learned a lot from that, just about what was going on in the internal machinations on health policy there on Capitol Hill. So Chris is joining us by phone. Chris, are you, in fact, we'll get him here in just a minute, but Chris has, if you're interested in knowing more about him, you can go to pointofview.net. We've got information up there about him and what he's doing. And then he also spent some time with Governor Bobby Jindal starting a think tank there that Governor Bobby Jindal was able to address and assess certain types of policy information. Chris, are you with us?
I am. It's great to be with you, Merrill.
Good talking to you again. How's everything going there?
We're just about recovered from the inauguration yesterday. So.
I know it's a challenge. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. You know, you and I have been talking about health policy for a long time, and you are one of the, I would argue, one of the country's top experts in this because you dig so deeply into a number of the health policy issues out there. So let's just give us a little bit. I've gone over your past a little bit, but give us a little bit about your history and health policy.
Yeah, so I've spent, now over 15 years in health policy on and off Capitol Hill. I worked for Mike Pence during the debate on Obamacare back in 2009. Worked in the Senate for the first couple of years the law was being implemented. Spent some time at the Heritage Foundation, as you mentioned, helped Governor Jindal start a new think tank in the time leading up to his presidential run. The past few years have been writing for the Federalist, writing for the Wall Street Journal, and putting out policy analysis and consulting work under my own banner, Juniper Research Group.
So we had, prior to Obamacare, we had a healthcare system that had some problems. I think everybody would admit that it had some problems, but it worked pretty well for the vast majority of people. It was somewhat expensive, but it was, about half the country had their health insurance through their employer. Most of them really liked that, especially unions loved that. You had Medicare and Medicaid, and that got most people covered. Barack Obama comes along and says, we've got a system that's just broken and has to be fixed. And he starts, when he gets inaugurated in 2009, starts pushing this through and ultimately is able to get that done in March of 2010. What was your assessment of of his complaints about the healthcare system at the time?
So, traditionally, I've always said that Barack Obama campaigned as a conservative and governed as a liberal.
Mm-hmm. No argument here.
Most people like their current coverage. They just think it costs too much. And so Barack Obama, when he was campaigning in 2007, 2008, said, infamously, if you liked your plan, you could keep it. He also said he would cut premiums by $2,500 within the first 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with all of that was he campaigned on lowering health care costs and keeping coverage. He ended up governing really that it turned into a major coverage expansion that was very costly, raised taxes, and then required some people to lose their coverage. They had to give up their coverage that they liked and raise premiums because the government was saying this is the coverage you must have. And those kind of requirements and mandates always end up raising premiums.
And it was interesting because one of the key things he wanted to try to address was the issue of the insurance companies who could deny somebody who's applying because they had a pre-existing condition. Now, you and I both know that in the employers market, which covers about half of the country, workers and their dependents, if you go to work for an employer, there was a few little provisions. You may have to wait 2 or 3 months, or there was a little look back if you came and you had a major medical condition or so forth. But for the most part, if you joined an employer, if you went to work for an employer and you had the employer plan, you got coverage in there. The employer could not say, well, we aren't going to cover you because you have a medical condition or anything of that nature. Under Medicare, if you turn 65 and join Medicare, you get coverage, even if you're on your deathbed with a medical condition. Or if you join Medicaid, which covers now about 70 or so million people, you get coverage. So the large majority of people in the country actually had something like a provision that would allow what we called guaranteed issue, that basically took them if they had a medical condition. You had a small group of people who were uninsured, they didn't have coverage, and if they were healthy, they could get policy in the individual market. If they were sick, there may have been a rider or something. But I always argued that, yes, this was a problem for some people, but it was a fairly small problem that was easily fixable. What is your take on this? We've got about a minute before our break.
So I would say that the problem is they're focusing on the symptom and not the disease. And unfortunately, Republicans, conservatives have been afraid of their shadow on pre-existing conditions for the past couple of years, since really the 2018 congressional campaign.
Isn't that the truth?
The problem is not pre-existing conditions. The problem is that your coverage isn't portable, so that when you lose your job, you lose your health coverage. That's the problem, where most people get stuck there. And that the problem is ultimately moving towards a more individually oriented system, because if you own your own health insurance, then nobody can take it away from you when you switch jobs, you lose your job, you want to retire, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, and so I think conservatives should focus more on promoting individual ownership of health insurance. Of course, the Democrats are all focused on the symptom, which is the pre-existing condition, and not the disease, because they don't want people to own their own health coverage. Ultimately, they want the government to own the coverage and the government to control it.
Very good
Other
point.
argument.
Let's hold that till we come back. My guest for this hour is Chris Jacobs. He's the founder and CEO of Juniper Research Group, and he's an expert on health policy. We're talking about Obamacare and whether or not Joe Biden will be able to improve that thing. Stay with us and we'll be back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
As even school children know, the British monarchy preceded the American Republic. The framers wanted to change many aspects of their previous government, so they wrote in Article 6 of the Constitution that no title of nobility should be granted by the federal government. But in other areas, they continued the British tradition of the king. One example is in Article 2 that grants the president the power to grant pardons. The framers justified it in a way to restore peace and tranquility. And it certainly provided some of that when clemency was given to Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. But so often the pardon power of the presidency has been misused. President Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, hoping to move the nation past the Watergate crisis. It probably cost him the election with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter pardoned nearly 200,000 Vietnam draft dodgers. Perhaps the greatest abuse of the pardon power came from Bill Clinton, who pardoned convicted terrorists with the Weather Underground, along with Patty Hearst, who joined a domestic terrorist group. The pardon most people remember is the pardon he gave to Mark Rich, a racketeer, in large part because of his donations to the Clinton Library and other Democratic candidates. We may appreciate some of the pardons President Trump gave to people like Dinesh D'Souza and Michael Flynn, but he also pardoned Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Charles Kushner, father of Jared Kushner. And since I'm writing this before Donald Trump has left office, the list may include many other pardons for other questionable recipients. Today, the criminal justice system provides numerous opportunities for citizens who face an injustice. Convictions can be vacated and expunged. That is why I think it is time to rein in pardon abuse. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. On the phone with me is Chris Jacobs. He's the founder and CEO of the Juniper Research Group and a longtime health policy expert. And we're talking about Obamacare and Joe Biden's efforts to try to improve that. Chris, right before we left, you made a very, very important point, because when people start thinking about health insurance, something clicks in their mind and they just don't think of health insurance like insurance. But you were making the point about personal insurance, and most all of the types of insurance we have, whether it's our auto insurance policy, our homeowner's policy, our life insurance policy, these are typically all owned by us as individuals. We make a decision on what we want. There's a lot of options out there. We buy it. We don't lose our life insurance. We don't lose our auto insurance policy when we change jobs. But health insurance, for some reason, people just think that's different, but it's insurance and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it is a different mindset, and I think it's because it's traditionally come from our employers that kind of pervades the philosophy. When it comes to pre-existing conditions, I view it as two halves of the same whole. The left wants to ensure that you have coverage after you develop a pre-existing condition. Because that's all they want to talk about. I, as a conservative, want to make sure that you get coverage before you develop a pre-existing condition. Because if you have coverage before you develop a pre-existing condition, then there's no problem. Your coverage is guaranteed renewable. You will have the same coverage at the same premium. The problem is the leftist strategy led to a doubling of premiums, more than doubling of premiums in the 4 years after Obamacare took effect, because you had all these people who had not had coverage before all of a sudden sign up very, very older and sicker individuals signing up for coverage. We need to have people sign up for coverage when they're young and healthy and sign up for that coverage and stay with that coverage throughout their working lives. Then you wouldn't have problems with premiums spiking as people get older.
It's an important point with respect to insurance because your homeowner's policy is not, the insurance company is not required to accept your homeowner's policy application when your house is burning down. You after you've had a car wreck, you can't go out and buy auto insurance for that wreck you just had. So we understand that, and individuals understand that in other types of insurance, but they just don't seem to understand it with health insurance. And there was a number of people uninsured when Obamacare passed. We were roughly looking, the percentage had been over the years, it sort of would range between 15 to 16 to 17% of the population was uninsured, so they didn't have health insurance. But as we wrote about at the time, the large majority of those people were healthy. If I remember right, about a third of them were eligible for Medicaid, where they were children eligible for Medicaid, and so they could have gotten it if their parents decided to enroll them, but they didn't do it. There were people who had plenty of money and just chose not to buy health insurance. There was a small percentage of those people who had a medical condition, and if they had gone to apply for a health insurance policy in what we call the individual market, they would have either been denied or a rider would have been put on there, or they might have been charged more for premiums. And that was, I would argue, that was a fairly easily fixable deal. In fact, most states, 35 states, had tried to fix it by creating a high risk pool. So we actually had a pretty good working network out there that could have used some adjustments and tweaks and perhaps a little federal money to help those with medical conditions. But it wasn't a system that was broken, and yet that's the case Barack Obama made.
Well, exactly. And the other point is, as I said, solve the problem of portability. This is something that the Trump administration actually tried to do and did a decent job of doing, creating a new mechanism called health reimbursement arrangements, which allows an employer to give an employee, rather than an employer saying, here's what your health coverage is. Your health coverage is a Blue Cross policy. If you don't like it, if your doctor's out of network, tough, you're stuck. Instead of that, the employer can now use this new health reimbursement arrangement under the Trump administration that they created through regulation. And the employer can say, here's $300 a month or $500 a month or whatever, a fixed amount that they put in a tax-free savings account, and the individual can go out and buy the coverage that they like, whether that's a Blue Cross plan, whether that's an Aetna plan, whether that's a United Health plan, whether it's an HSA plan, whether it's an HMO. They get what they want, and when they switch jobs, the different employer will contribute. They will lose their employer contribution, but they will still have the same coverage. And they can go to their next employer, and their next employer can provide them with $400 a month instead of $500 a month. It creates portable coverage, and that's really what we need to be moving to. If everybody bought coverage when they were young, in their teens or in their college years, you would have some percentage of the population, of course, with birth defects or congenital heart defects or that sort of thing, that would need protection from pre-existing conditions. But by and large, if you have the same coverage for 30, 40, 50 years, you don't need to worry about pre-existing conditions because you've got the same plan and you're always covered.
You know, Barack Obama tried to make the case that the Affordable Care Act was going to give everybody access to high-quality health insurance, a lot of options at lower prices. And it didn't fulfill any of those things. In fact, it exacerbated the problems that we were seeing throughout the system and made it worse. Why was that the case?
Because of the mandates and the requirements. Like I said, and a lot of that was forcing health insurers to accept everyone who applies. And what that means is healthy people don't want to sign up until they're sick, until they get sick. And so premiums went up 103% from 2013 to 2017. They also prescribed a lot of benefits and said you had to cover X, Y, Z benefits, whether it's and as you know, you used to compile the state list. There were over 3,000 different benefit mandates in the states that you have to cover, whether it's in vitro fertilization treatment or hair prosthesis or chiropractic treatments or these sorts of things. All of those kinds of benefit mandates increased the price of care and the price of coverage. Those kind of mandates, imposing them on the federal level, the prime reason why premiums went through the roof.
Yeah, my organization used to publish the state mandate list, and it was growing every year. And as you point out, if you come in, it makes health insurance more comprehensive, but it also makes it more costly because you've got so many more things that insurance is being required to cover. So we had this situation where premiums increased, people lost their coverage, including my wife. She had a Blue Cross policy that she was very satisfied with. We thought it was a great policy here in Texas, and I wouldn't call it cheap, but we could make the payments. Once Obamacare came in, her premium started going up. I think after our first year, the premiums went up. The Blue Cross plan was canceled, so we couldn't use that one anymore because it wasn't Obamacare qualified. And so as soon as she went to the Obamacare policy, the premiums went up from a $2,500 deductible up to, I think, a $6,000 deductible, and the premiums went up by 50%. So we had our deductible almost tripled, and we had to pay 50% more. And we got a note from Blue Cross. There's the middle of the next year that there was, I think, 400,000 Texans in that policy, and they lost $400 million, even though we were paying more and they covered less. It was a disaster.
Right, and that's because of all of the sick individuals that came into the pool once Obamacare went into effect. And everybody says pre-existing conditions, we want the pre-existing condition protections. And, of course, these liberal think tanks like the Kaiser Family Foundation, they always ask, well, do you like the pre-existing condition protection? Well, of course, everybody says yes. But what these Kaiser groups don't ask is, would you like these pre-existing condition protections if you knew they raised your premiums by $3,000 or $5,000 per year? And in many cases, that's what they do. And the liberal organizations will never ask that kind of question. They don't want to ask about the trade-offs. I went and asked them, emailed them, and I said, I think this is a biased question. Will you consider more? And they would not.
Back when I used to propose high deductible health plans with the $2,500 deductible for a family, liberals used to accuse me of being in the pocket of the insurance companies because they said, you got to pay $2,500 and you got to pay these premiums, and the insurance company has to wait doesn't have to pay the first $2,500. Now the deductibles in the bronze plans are $6,000, $7,000 per person, maybe $14,000 for a family, and Democrats seem to think that's great. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion with Chris Jacobs. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question or a comment about health insurance and Obamacare, stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And on the line with me is Chris Jacobs. He is the founder and CEO of the Juniper Research Group and a specialist in health policy. Chris, I was going to ask this question, but I've got Matthew on the line in Georgia, and I'm going to see if I can get our new system to work here. And Matthew, Matthew has a question about Trump's efforts to try to address Obamacare. Matthew, go right ahead.
Yes, I was listening and I was hearing about the increase in the premiums on Obamacare and the effects of individuals having their own policies, but there's no discussion that has been taken place discussing the Trump administration to dismantle Obamacare, and surely that had some effects on the effectiveness of the entire process.
Good question,
and
Matthew. Let's see what Chris has to say on that. Chris?
Well, I think the Trump administration did what they could do to try to deregulate the exchanges and to make the exchanges work to mitigate some of the effects of the premium increases. Ultimately, though, changing that would have required legislative action and action by Congress. And so that's where that fell short. And because Congress in 2017 could not come up with alternative legislation, the Trump administration was trying to make lemonade out of lemons to make the law work as best they could.
You know, Chris, to Matthew's point, though, the tax law that passed in December 2017 eliminated the mandate to have health insurance. I did not think that would actually create much of a problem for the. I didn't think it'd have that much of an impact on the premiums. What's your thinking about eliminating the mandate? And actually didn't eliminate it; actually just zeroed out the penalty. But did that have an impact on premiums, you think?
It didn't appear to have much of an impact. At the time, I thought that they were better off. My concern was, and this ended up bearing out, was that they said, well, we got rid of the mandate, therefore that's all we can do, and kind of wash your hands and move away from it. I think they need to do a better job of really getting at those regulations.
And one of the things
that raised the premiums in the first place.
And one of the things, if I remember right, they were not paying the insurance companies for some adjustments that went on. I won't get into the details, but they were withholding money because it said the legislation didn't actually appropriate the money from Congress to do that. I think the courts finally said you have to pay that. But would that have affected the premium cost?
That had some impact on premiums, but frankly, as you pointed out, Merrill, the Obama administration was spending money on the subsidies that it did not have constitutional authority to spend. And in fact, the day before the 2016 election, I made what ended up being the very relevant point. I said, well, if the Obama administration can spend money without appropriation from Congress to prop up Obamacare, essentially, then the Trump administration could spend money on border security and a border wall without money from Congress. And I didn't like either one of those things because I think Congress is the legislative branch. They control the purse strings. And I didn't like the Obama administration spending money to prop up Obamacare any more than I did the Trump administration diverting money to try to create border security.
Thank you, Matthew. It was a very good point to bring that up, and we should be discussing that. And Chris, on that issue, because of Obamacare, I think roughly 85% of the people who are in the Obamacare exchanges, that is people who go in and buy their own policy through the Obamacare exchanges, they're not in Medicare, Medicaid, they don't have employer-based insurance. Roughly 85% receive subsidies from the federal government. So even as the premiums were going up, their premiums were being subsidized, so that most of those people did not feel the full impact of that. If you made too much to qualify for the subsidies, you felt the full impact of it.
Well, that's right. The unsubsidized population has shrunk by several million in the past few years as these premium increases have taken place. So by and large, the only people on the exchanges are people who are getting a federal subsidy. Now, Joe Biden wants to change all that by saying nobody would have to pay more than 8.5% of income on premiums, regardless of what your income is. Well, the problem of that is that's going to increase subsidies to wealthier and affluent families. There was an analysis that said in some cases, and this is somewhat rare, people making as much as $300,000 would qualify for Obamacare subsidy. And I think that shows the errors of the law to, first off, put in these regulations that made premiums unaffordable for the vast majority of people, whether it's your wife or myself on the exchanges or others, and then solve that problem of creating an unaffordable system of care by taking taxpayer money to kind of as a Band-Aid to fix the problem. That's not fixing the problem.
Yeah, it's a very good point to make, because some of our listeners may be saying, well, wait a minute, I'm actually paying less for insurance today than I was before the legislation passed, and they're in the individual market. That the insurance itself doesn't cost less. The insurance itself costs more. It's just that the taxpayers are footing that difference so that it looks less expensive to many people, but in fact, it's actually much more expensive, and my guess is it's going to go up. You know, one of the things that Joe Biden wants to do is include a public option. Can you tell us what a public option is?
So, well, first of all, it's not really an option. It's not an option for the people whose taxpayer funds are going to be used to subsidize it. It's essentially a government-run health plan. And so the idea is to save money by paying doctors and hospitals less. That they want to save money by using Medicare or some kind of, the left says Medicare can negotiate better rates, but Medicare, as you know, Merrill, doesn't really negotiate.
No.
They say,
it dictates.
Here's the price, take it or leave it. And in a lot of cases does not even meet the cost of care for a doctor or a hospital. And so that's the plan to make coverage more affordable, essentially by paying doctors and hospitals less.
And they actually had a type of public option in Obamacare, and all of those they were opened up at the states, and I think virtually all of those, or nearly all of them, have shut down, haven't they?
There were co-ops, which were nonprofit health organizations established by Obamacare, and I think all but 3 or 4 of them ended up folding. Taxpayers ended up losing several $billion in seed money for these cooperatives. That was viewed as an alternative to a government-run health plan. So those were somewhat equivalent. There's also one example out in Washington State where they are trying to establish a state-run government plan. And in that case, the premiums are actually somewhat higher for the government plan than for private sector plans in many cases.
You know, Chris, one of the things I found so cynical when Democratic presidential candidates were having their debates and the issue of health care came up, I think virtually all of them talked about the broken health care system and how they needed to fix it. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, why don't one of the news anchors here say, well, isn't that Obamacare that's the broken system? I mean, that's what you passed. And ironically, it was passed to fix a number of problems. You know, some of them are proposing a Medicare buy-in. So if you're, say, 55 and you want to buy into Medicare, you could not go into Obamacare. You could just simply buy into the Medicare plan. And the irony here is that was Obamacare was supposed to fix the problems for people who were 55, 60, 62, 63, didn't have access to health insurance or couldn't afford the ones because of their age. And so Obamacare was going to fix that problem, and now it's still a mess. I'm going to get you to answer that when we come back. My guest right now is Chris Jacobs. He is the founder and CEO of Juniper Research Group, based there in the Washington, D.C. area. He's had a long experience in health policy. If you want to know more about him or reach out to him, his contact information is on pointofview.net. You can go there and find out a little bit more about him and find out how to contact him if you have any questions or other things. We're going to be talking in our last segment about some of these problems with Obamacare and whether or not Joe Biden can actually fix that with some of the solutions he has on the agenda. I don't think they're good. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to put in a last-minute quick call. 1-800-351-1212.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View in our final segment, talking about Obamacare with Chris Jacobs, who is a health policy expert. And Chris, we've got somebody on the line, Dwight in Georgia, who has a question about insurance company profits. Dwight, you're on the air.
Hello. Hey, I just wanted to find out what kind of profits do insurance companies make pre-Obamacare, during Obamacare, and after that?
It's a really good question because, as I recall, I don't recall about the profits, but I know the number of insurance companies after Obamacare passed, the stock prices started rising significantly for them. Chris, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, certainly they've received a windfall from Obamacare. Now, I think the left has overstated the impact of health insurance profits on the system. In other words, if we got rid of all health insurance profits, it would pay for 12 hours or a day or so of the current healthcare system. This is not the panacea that everybody can get all the healthcare we want for free if profits went away.
But Chris, it's an important point because during the debates on Obamacare, the Democrats, they vilified the insurance companies. These companies are profiting off health care and they're profiting off sick people and so forth. And so a reasonable person could think that the insurance companies would have actually done worse under Obamacare. But you're saying Democrats were responsible for them doing fairly well.
They've certainly their profits and their bottom lines increased. The other thing is there's been a lot of consolidation within the industry, and this is not just the health insurance industry. Mm-hmm. This is hospitals buying doctor groups and physician groups and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so there's been a lot of that really since Obamacare, since about 2010. The number of hospital mergers has grown. And so we've seen these healthcare oligopolies, monopolies, essentially fighting each other for larger and larger market share so they can command higher and higher prices. Obamacare, that trend existed prior to Obamacare, but Obamacare certainly accelerated it.
Thank you, Dwight. It was a very important question to bring up. Chris, you mentioned the prices and so forth and negotiations in the last segment. But that brings us to the issue of price controls because Joe Biden and I think most Democrats want to impose price controls throughout the healthcare system, whether you're talking about prescription drugs, medical devices, insurance, doctors' fees, hospital prices. What's your thoughts on the price control efforts that we will be seeing here in the near future?
Well, I think you would certainly see that in terms of a government-run health plan and government-run, whether it's a government-run health plan or a single-payer system. I wrote a book on this issue, The Case Against Single Payer, and there and elsewhere I've made the point that single-payer or any of these kind of, whether it's a government plan, the quote public option, or any of these kind of schemes, they basically operate under the premise that doctors and physicians and nurses and medical professionals will gladly get paid less to do more work. That's the essential premise of single payer, that you will get paid less and you will do more work. You will do more work because we will make all health care free. We will cover everyone. You can have all the health care you want. We'll have lines out the door at the hospitals, et cetera, but you will get paid less for treating all of these patients. There's an inherent logical problem to that.
It's an interesting point because the left always said you had these uninsured people and the rest of us are paying for it and we're having to pay higher premiums because of the uninsured. But in fact, when Milliman Inc., or one of the largest actuarial companies in the country, did this analysis, they frequently came up, they did it over several years, and the real cost shifting that was going on, according to them, was Medicare and Medicaid, the two government-run plans. They're underpaying. Medicare, if I remember right, paid about 20% less than a standard insurance company for the same procedure. And Medicaid, the federal state program for the poor, paid, I think, oftentimes 30-40% less than what a standard insurance company would pay. And as a result, the idea was that doctors were taking Medicare patients, Medicaid patients, taking the government allotment, but perhaps charging more to people with private insurance to offset their losses for the government plan.
Well, that's exactly right. And what happens when you get fewer and fewer people on private insurance, fewer and fewer people with employer insurance, and the government plan that pays below cost keeps growing and growing and growing? hospitals and doctors are going to end up getting squeezed.
And you can't sort of overemphasize the irony here as the left comes out and says, look how much less Medicare and Medicaid pay for prescription drugs, health care, and other things than people are having to pay under private insurance. But one of the reasons why we're paying more under private insurance is because Medicare and Medicaid pay so much less. There's a huge contradiction there that the left never concedes.
Right, and I think that's the problem. Joe Biden has a plan to allow individuals to, if you think you can get a better deal on the Obamacare exchanges, that you can go on the Obamacare exchanges and still qualify for a subsidy. Right now, if you have coverage from your employer, you can go buy exchange coverage, but you have to pay the full premium. You can't qualify for a subsidy. Well, I did an analysis, and there have been other analyses, that would anywhere from 15, 20, 25 million people would suddenly end up going on to the exchanges. So you have a massive migration away from employer coverage. It would destabilize employer coverage, and it would also put people on these lower-paying exchange plans or lower-paying the government-run plan that Joe Biden wants to create. That's the kind of movement that would accelerate the momentum towards a single-payer system.
Chris, if people are interested in finding a copy of your book on the single-payer system, is there a way they can find that?
Absolutely. It's The Case Against Single Payer. It's available from Republic bookstores or on Amazon or your local bookstore.
And when did you write that?
The book, I wrote it in the spring of 2019, so it's still fairly current. I'm thinking about doing an update at some point, but it certainly shows and it goes through the legislation provision by provision and lays out the case about how this would be destructive to our economy and our healthcare system. Well,
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this with our listeners and taking their questions and so forth, and I appreciate it. You are one of the country's experts on this, and we really appreciate your work in that because we're going to need it over the next few months, I suspect.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And if you want to find out more or reach out to Chris, we have the information on the Point of View website, pointofview.net. You can go there and find out more about him. Joe Biden wants to try to move this health care provision because he had some ownership in Obamacare because it was passed during the Obama-Biden administration. He's been pushing back a little bit against the single-payer health care system. We'll see if Bernie Sanders and AOC have the power to be able to make him change that and move towards trying to support a single-payer system. We just don't know right now. Well, thank you for joining us on Point of View. Been an interesting discussion over several of these things. You can go to Point of View and find out more about us and about future programs we have. And there's even a button there to donate if you're interested in donating to Point of View. And I would encourage you to go and take a look at that and do that. I believe Kirby's going to be back tomorrow, so you'll be able to come back and join him later. Thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.